What's going on, everybody? Jack here, another episode of The Big and Bold, and we get to talk about real football games that have been played from week one of this college football season. I went and I looked at the first week of games from last season, kind of compared them to this season, and I must say that this was a fantastic week one. Last year, you had some big games. You know, in hindsight, some of the teams didn't have as good a year as we thought they would, but Penn State versus Wisconsin was a big game in the Big Ten. Alabama played Miami. Miami wasn't a very good team down the long run, but Georgia-Clemson was a huge game. There were massive playoff implications there. Montana pulled off a huge upset against Washington. But this year, I think we had an even better start to the season. And I'm going to kick it off by talking about the two teams ranked in the top 10 of the AP poll that lost over the weekend. And the first game I want to talk about is 5th-ranked Notre Dame that went on the road to play 2nd-ranked Ohio State. And there are a few big takeaways from that matchup. One, yes, Notre Dame lost. But considering that line on that game climbed from 14 points, I think all the way up to over 17, and Notre Dame only lost 10-21 in Marcus Freeman's first season opener as the head coach. He also lost their season finale last year in their near Six Bowl to Oklahoma State, where the offense was firing up in that game, but the defense failed them. In this game, the offense failed them, but their defense played phenomenal football. Notre Dame had Ohio State to only 14 points going into the fourth quarter. That was Ohio State's lowest point total since they got blown out in the playoff in 2016 to Clemson. The lowest point total since 2016. That just isn't something that happens these days at Ohio State. But the Notre Dame defense was able to do that, and I was incredibly impressed with that unit. What failed Notre Dame was their offense. I would say that they tried to keep it to that 3 yards in a cloud of dust, but they averaged 2.5 yards on the game. So that doesn't necessarily apply in this case. It was even worse than that. They need to work on their offense moving forward. I'm incredibly impressed with the defense, but offensively they really struggled. Their run game was not there. Tyler Buchner, quarterback from Notre Dame, also started his first game as a quarterback. So that was a very difficult environment to have your first start. He tried to make some plays, but ultimately was contained by the Ohio State defense. And that's another thing I want to talk about is Ohio State defensively showed immense improvement from last year. We knew they had the talent. You know, Zach Harrison, Tommy Eichenberg, just to name a couple of guys. They have a ridiculously talented defense, but it was one of their biggest weaknesses last year. But Ohio State defensive coordinator Jim Knowles, his first year with the program, showed that he knows how to use all that talent. He did a phenomenal job as the defensive coordinator for Oklahoma State. Then this year comes in his first game as a defensive coordinator for Ohio State and held Notre Dame to just 10 points. So he did a phenomenal job. And their defense is confusing to play against. Like, they'll have 3 down linemen, show you 4 linebackers potentially bringing pressure, and they could drop all 4 of them back into coverage. Or 2. You know, the way that defense works is a little confusing, and it's hard to play against, as Notre Dame showed. And Ohio State showed they're not going to get pushed around this year at the point of attack. That's what cost them the couple of losses last season to Oregon and Michigan. And you could win the physicality game against Ohio State. I will say that was one issue for them last year. Another issue that I don't think they really corrected was when you get pressure in C.J. Stroud's face, he struggles. Notre Dame only had 1 sack on the game, but they were able to get in C.J. Stroud's face from time to time, and he had trouble adjusting from that. Don't get me wrong, he didn't play a terrible game. But between the pressure that was occasionally there and the lack of 2 phenomenal wide receivers in Garrett Wilson and Chris Olave, both got drafted in the first round last year, he had trouble adjusting to that. I think we kind of assumed that they would make that transition easily because they had Jackson Smith and Jigba, and they had these really talented receivers who were stepping up to fill those roles. But there was kind of a lack of chemistry there in that game, and Stroud struggled a little bit. He still played a good game. And in the second half, he pulled them forward, and they were able to come away with a win. But the offense struggled. So that's something they're going to need to work on a little bit moving forward, is I think the chemistry with the new wide receivers in that wide receiving core. Jackson Smith and Jibba's got to get healthy. Notre Dame knocked him out of the game early. He's going to sit the next 2 weeks because they got a couple of gimme games before playing Wisconsin, and they really want him to be healthy. Because I can tell you Wisconsin is not going to be held at 2.5 yards per carry. And their defense is pretty formidable as well. So that's going to be a really interesting game to watch in a few weeks. The other game I want to talk about was Utah. 7th-ranked Utah went on the road to play Florida. It was Billy Napier's first game as the head coach for Florida. Despite the fact that Utah was able to drive down the field for what would have been a game-winning touchdown or game-tying field goal, Cameron Rising did throw a pick in the red zone. Really, the only thing I'm going to say about Utah, their red zone offense was not the best. That's something you see from time to time, is at the beginning of the year, that play calling in the red zone could really be improved. I mean, Florida had 7 or 8 defenders in the red zone waiting to see what Cameron Rising was going to do. So their play calling there needed to be better. But overall, they played a solid game. They had a lot of trouble adjusting to the Florida offense. There was a lot of movement, both pre-snap and then their ability to draw a lot of defenders to one side and then play go the other. Anthony Richardson could hurt you with his arm and his legs. I'm not quite there yet that Anthony Richardson is this Heisman candidate quarterback. He threw for 168 yards, guys. I mean, he did all his damage on the ground. He is an incredibly talented quarterback, though, and you can see it. And he's in an offense that's built for him to succeed. So great job by Florida. They needed to get a big win, I think, early. They've got Kentucky this upcoming weekend. They could start their season with 2 wins against top 25 opponents and quickly find themselves ranked in the top 15. But they needed to show that they could kind of get that first win, and it was against a 7th-ranked Utah team. So that's big for Florida. Utah learned a lot from this loss as well. It's a non-conference game, week 1, on the road, across the country. Losing the way they did, it could be worse. No shame losing this game, in my opinion, for Utah. I think they learned a lot. They were able to run the football. Cameron Rising, I think, learned a lot in this game. Defensively, there are some things they need to adjust to. But Utah could have played a worse game. When we look at their schedule, they should be the favorite up until probably playing USC. But if you're talking about high-flying offenses, UCLA, USC, this game helped them a lot, I think, in preparing for those future matchups. So that was a really entertaining game to watch with a lot of lead changes in that one. Now, an interesting thing here, a couple of teams lost week 1, but I don't think that they need to be all that worried about it. And the first team I'm going to talk about is LSU. Now, LSU did lose an ugly game. They lost 23-24 to Florida State in Brian Kelly's first game as the head coach at LSU. Now, if you were a Brian Kelly hater and didn't like the hire to LSU, then you're talking about his future firing from the program and blowing this game way out of proportion. Yes, LSU looked really bad. But over the course of the game, Jaden Daniels, in his first game as the quarterback for LSU, you're starting to notice the pattern here, right? When you're first-year head coach, first year as a starter, kind of like with Notre Dame and Marcus Freeman, there are some difficulties with that, right? Jaden Daniels transferred over from Arizona State, his first start with LSU. He ended up being the sole focal point of their offense. Yes, they need to figure out how to run the ball without Jaden Daniels. They need to get the ball to Keyshawn Butte. These things are true. But props to Florida State. They played a good game. Mike Norvell just got a huge win when he came into the year on the hot seat as the head coach for Florida State. But here's my thing with LSU. Outside of the game, outside of the blocked field goal to tie the game at the end there, LSU has been one of the best programs of the last 20 years. Since the year 2000, only 2 programs have won 3 national championships or more. Alabama, who's won 100, and LSU, who's won 3. That was with 3 different head coaches, Nick Saban, Les Miles, and Ed Orgeron. And I think LSU is thinking, if we can win a national championship with Ed Orgeron, then we can probably be, at the very least, a competitive team with Brian Kelly, who took Notre Dame to a BCS national championship game and took them to the playoff and went 11-1 last season. But here's the thing with Brian Kelly. He had bad years at Notre Dame. He had great years at Notre Dame, but he couldn't win the big one. The idea is that with the talent that LSU has and is able to bring into that program, Brian Kelly is going to be able to succeed. But it's going to probably take some time. I think that this year is going to have some ups and downs for LSU. But I'm not going to blow this loss out of proportion for them. In the other game I want to talk about, Cincinnati was a week 1 loser. They're going to fall out of the top 25. But they played far better than I thought they would in this game against Arkansas. I'm really high on Arkansas. I've got them as a top 15 team this year. But they managed to kick their season off with a win over a top 25 opponent, last year's playoff team, Cincinnati. Cincinnati replaced everyone after last season, starting quarterback. I think their leading rusher, leading tackler, their top 2 receivers and top 2 corners. Cincinnati replaced everybody. But they were still able to play a competitive game against Arkansas, where they lost on the road 24-31. That was an ugly first half. They were shut out 14-0 in the first half, but they were able to come back and make it a competitive football game. So I'm not worried if I'm Cincinnati. They're going to be a favorite in the majority of their games moving forward. Some of their most challenging games are like Indiana, who they got at home. They got to go on the road to play Tulsa. Cincinnati could easily finish as a 10-2 team this season. So I'm not worried about that loss. Now, two teams who won this past week that I am worried about, North Carolina for one. North Carolina defensively was putrid against Appalachian State. Now, App State scored 61 points on North Carolina. This game was absolutely disgusting to watch. This is a reason why a lot of people don't like college football, is because there's no defense half the time. North Carolina won 63-61 in a game where there were 124 combined points. App State scored 40 points in the fourth quarter to end the game. I'm wondering, what is Mack Brown doing at North Carolina? I mean, he's in his fourth year. I think he turned 72 this season. What's he doing? Obviously the offense is great. We know that he can coach a great offense. And Drake May is a phenomenal quarterback. He honestly looks like the next Justin Herbert to me, not to be a little too aggressive with that prediction. But he's a phenomenal quarterback. And I've been a Drake May fan since he, had been committed for North Carolina for a couple of years and was waiting for him to take the starting job. He played a phenomenal game, but the defense in North Carolina is ridiculously bad. It was bad last year. It was bad the year before. That's been what's holding them back from being a big boy in the ACC. So yeah, they won this game. But what are they going to do against Notre Dame? Or even Miami, Pitt, Virginia and Wake Forest, NC State. These teams who on paper should be better than App State. And I'm worried about North Carolina, because what if they go 7-5? And it's just another below average season for Mack Brown. It's what's this guy doing? Something needs to change at North Carolina quickly. And conversely, another team that won, and you kind of ask yourself, what are you doing, is Iowa. Iowa beat South Dakota State 7-3. And that wasn't even a touchdown for Iowa. That was off of a field goal and two safeties. It was one of the worst offensive performances I've honestly ever seen. Iowa's offense may be worse than it was last year. And it was bad last year. The fact that South Dakota State could have gone down the field in the fourth quarter to win that game is disgusting. Iowa should not have been in that position. They were playing that game at home. Spencer Petras is back. He was their starting quarterback last year. Combined, and I'm not hating on South Dakota State for this one because it's South Dakota State, but combined, the two teams had 33 third downs. They combined on 7 of them. They converted on 7 of those 33 third downs. Spencer Petras had 109 yards and an interception. They averaged 1.6 rushing yards per carry. Iowa offensively, it's hard to get worse than that. And again, you just wonder. Kirk Ferentz has been there since 1999, and the offense is still the same. I see people making jokes, Big Ten football's back, but keep Iowa over there. That's Iowa football for you. This is not the Iowa of old, in 2015 when they were a top 10 team, or back in the 2000s when they were a top 10 team. Iowa is offensively inept, and it's holding that program back. I mean, I can't care more about Iowa football than Iowa football fans, but it's just embarrassing to see how bad their offense is. And Kirk Ferentz is going to have to make a change, because this is going to be a really bad year for them if they don't make some sort of adjustment in the over the course of the rest of the season. And then to wrap up the video, some teams that surprisingly struggled week 1. Michigan State, NC State, both teams struggled. I have NC State as a borderline top 10 team, and they really struggled against Eastern Carolina. Michigan State against Western Michigan, they looked bad in that game. Western Michigan was in it for way too long. And if that was last year's Western Michigan team, there's a possibility they win that game. Oklahoma State gave up 44 points to Central Michigan. Knowles, the current Ohio State defensive coordinator, left Oklahoma State this past offseason. Clearly they miss him and miss some of those starters that they had from last year on defense. Oklahoma State could be another team in for a rough season this year. And then finally, but to close it out, Oregon sucks. We knew that Georgia was going to be a really good team and not a great team. Obviously, they won a national championship last year. But I just thought with all the talent that Georgia lost, and with Dan Lanning coming over from Georgia, former defensive coordinator there, now the head coach at Oregon, that maybe he'd be able to get something going for them in this game. But no, Oregon looked pretty terrible. And I think that conference is probably going to be run by Utah and USC this season. Unless Oregon can make some sort of magical jump offensively. But thank you for listening, everybody. I wanted to give you my rundown of week 1. So there it is. Please like and subscribe if you haven't already. This was a great weekend of games, and I can't wait to see how the next weekend goes.